So my anxiety journey, I feel like I've always had anxiety. It's kind of just something I've grown up with and I've kind of been around, and it's always just kind of been inside of me, and most of the time it had to do with social situations and just being really uncomfortable and just not being comfortable in social situations. Or so it was either that I was kind of low-level anxious about, or it was like a fear, like an anxiety fear thing, where just being afraid of like being home alone at night, or that somebody was gonna attack me, or just like it was kind of a fear that was associated with my anxiety. But then, so I kind of had that my whole life. Those are kind of like the low-level things that I deal with. And then a couple years ago, I had kind of a really strange experience. We had a lot going on in our life, a lot of life changes, a lot of stuff going around us that was kind of moving, and I don't know if it was because I didn't know how to deal with it, if I didn't know how to cope with it, but I started having like panic attacks. And so we have a good friend who's a counselor, and Brenton had seen him before too, and so I went in and saw him, and he diagnosed me with what's called bottom-up panic attacks. And so it's when you have that, it's your body, you can be in a totally fine like mental space, but then your body will just throw yourself into a panic attack. So it's really unpredictable. And it would happen in the most random places, and when, just really off guard. And so when I started seeing this counselor, and he diagnosed me with that, I tried to kind of cope through it and work through it when those things would happen, and breathing techniques and that kind of stuff. And because of the nature of the panic attacks, and because they were completely random, it wasn't like I was obsessive about something. It was hard to manage. And so we had decided that I was going to go on medication. So I went on like an antidepressant, SSRI, for a little while, and that seemed to help me kind of manage it. And then along with that, I continued doing counseling, and so that's kind of how I functioned for a little while when I was dealing with all of this stuff. And then I was in a Bible study over the summer and was with a whole bunch of new women, building new relationships, and they kind of spoke this like, like a new perspective over me, I think. And they kind of, as I was talking and as I was explaining what I was experiencing, they all kind of just looked at me sideways, and they were like, I think this sounds like a spiritual gift almost. This sounds like the gift of discernment, because it would happen in all of these like public places, and like I was almost taking on what other people were experiencing. And I was completely caught off guard by that. That was just not something I had expected. But then I thought about it and I prayed about it, and I was really intrigued by that idea. And so after that, I decided to wean myself off the medication. And ever since then, those panic attacks stopped. And whenever I would get some sort of like tightness in my chest, or someone's choking me kind of a feeling, it would be like an immediate reaction to go, okay, God, what is this? Like, what are you trying to show me? Who around me needs prayer? It's sort of this like intercessor discernment sort of thing now that I use it as. And it's kind of a connection now that I have to God, like that when I have these kind of random like panics, that I need to be aware of something. And it's always just me and God. It's not like I will walk up to somebody, or if I feel like somebody around me is struggling, I don't usually address that person. It's just something between me and God, and it's a communication. So that's kind of, and now I'm kind of back to that low level. Like I still struggle with social anxiety and that kind of stuff, but those panic attacks have stopped. So that's kind of where I'm at. Yeah, it was not a perspective, like I was really taken back when the women were like, I think this is a spiritual gift. And here I am like trying to like, and not that medication's wrong, because I really appreciated my experience with it. But when I had someone kind of suggest that it was a gift, that it was a way that God was trying to communicate with me, I was kind of numbing it with my medication. I was kind of cutting him off, which is why I started to wean off of it. And he stood there in the gap. Like, he was like, yep, I'm trying to communicate with you, and I just need you to trust me. And so, yeah, that's definitely Jesus, that I have not had any more like random, that bottom-up panic.
Mine is not a spiritual gift. So I would say my first experience with like anxiety or depression was I got bullied really bad, like my 7th and 8th grade year. And some of this, as time goes on, some of it kind of bleeds all together, but basically wasn't very popular, wasn't a part of the popular group, and the only people that I was friends with kind of abandoned me for a while. And when it got really bad, I actually, wanted to kill myself, wanted to be dead. I didn't make it to school for about 8 or 9 days in a row. Saw a counselor. They put me on some medications. Really did not help. It's interesting, my journey with medication. What took me out of that, I would love to say, is God. And in ways, my mom, my grandma, my dad, I had a lot of people praying for me. And so my future experiences, I really didn't deal with anxiety all that much. Off and on some, when I started out in the career I'm in, because it's not an easy career, had some anxiety, had some depression, but most recently, after having thyroid cancer and having my thyroid removed, I didn't realize how much that affects your mood. And so I don't know how much of the anxiety and depression I've had a couple of years ago, that happened about 6 months after my cancer. I don't know how much of that is from just hormone imbalances, or how much is because of Satan, maybe. I'm definitely sure that there's times where Satan used what I was unsure of, but ultimately I've learned that anxiety is typically a lack of trust. Anxiety stems, a decent amount, if not all anxiety stems from a lack of trust. And I was told that by a counselor I saw actually within the past year. I hadn't actually seen a counselor. I do have a friend who's very knowledgeable in this area, but I didn't see him clinically. And so he was very impactful with helping me try to combat it, but he didn't see me clinically. But the person who I actually saw clinically, and I was very intentional about who I saw, because I wanted to find someone who knew mental health but also was a Christian, and that's not easy. So I did find someone, and one of the things I quickly realized about why seeing a counselor is important is that verbalizing and getting thoughts out of your head and talking with someone who is wise helps defeat lies. Satan does well when he isolates, and so when things aren't verbalized and when things aren't talked about, that is where the evil one or Satan, that's where he will win there, when you're alone and when you're not verbalizing. So sometimes I think, there's such a stigma around counselors, but sometimes I think just the simple benefit of a counselor is that you're forced to talk about something that you don't want to talk about. And but one of the things he did a lot of just helping me verbalize and make me talk about things that I wasn't necessarily afraid to talk about, but it was consistent. And one of the things he pointed out, which was very true, and I've learned, is just anxiety or depression, and especially anxiety, can often stem from a lack of trust. You basically want to have control of something, and you do not have control of something. So therefore, it's a lack of trust. And so that is incredibly problematic. But it's interesting because if the deeper you dive into your relationship with Jesus, the more you can see why the apostles might be completely free of anxiety, because in the worst of circumstances, they were trusting of who was taking care of them. Leading up to my thyroid cancer, even after my thyroid cancer, those who are close to me probably can attest to this, is that I wasn't scared or afraid of my health. Actually, God had I knew something was wrong before any doctor diagnosed something, and I wasn't afraid of it. I remember even after the surgery, I wasn't afraid. It wasn't fear in that way, shape, or form. It was almost like cancer was over 3 to 5 months later, and I was like, I feel like this mental picture of like watching someone run and feeling like you beat it, and you're looking behind you, and all of a sudden you run into a brick wall that you just didn't even know was in front of you. And I still am not exactly sure what caused it, although I know what to do now that defeats anxiety and depression. I know the tools that I can use. That's not medication. I'm still on medication, which I will come off of. I have found things that help me defeat anxiety and depression, and I would say there's really like 4 that I can think of at a high level. One is pretty generic, but getting outside. It's called mindfulness activities, but I think it's cool because I'm kind of an outdoor geek. I'm kind of I love being out in the woods, and I think maybe this is just the way God created this. But anytime I spend time in God's creation, it's interesting. If you look into the research, what happens is you come out of the high level thinking of your brain and you come into the stem of your brain, where anytime you're engaging a lot more of your senses and you're interacting with God's creation, which is outdoors, which is in the woods, it is physically impossible to have anxiety. So if you hear about green therapy, if you hear about green space, things, that's what they're talking about, and it works. It's 100% true. I've had horrible anxiety weeks, and if I go out to a piece of property I own and I just spend time planting trees, you could think of it as gardening, things like that. The next thing I know, I'm like, man, I spent a half a day and I don't have any anxiety. And I think God probably designed us to be doing a lot more of that than we're actually doing nowadays. I'd say that's one. I would say being in either a couple small group, a men's group, and making yourself or having people who know about it discuss it so that it can't stay in your head, like I maybe kind of talked about earlier. That's huge. Having people that maybe struggle with it, who can ask you how is that going, and hopefully if you're in a small group, people are checking in on you, people are asking you how you're doing, and hopefully you're telling the truth. And if you're not doing well, you'll catch that anxiety and depression train far before it comes off the rails. So after that counselor and meeting with him, I've realized I need to talk about it well before it ever becomes a problem. Because Satan does well in solitude, and when thoughts go unchecked and thoughts create new thoughts, and thoughts basically get to a place when you actually verbalize it, it sounds kind of insane. Because
you have like a runaway train thought process when it comes.
Yeah.
Just like it always ends like worst case scenario in his brain, and I'm like, okay, we need to nip this in the butt. Like this is probably it's not gonna happen. And so
I would say,
runaway train.
Maybe the third one would be I've been very intentional since I've been married, even before I was married, about having mentors and just someone who disciples me, and the person who's probably been doing that for me the past couple of years is very knowledgeable in this area, and it wasn't the reason I picked them necessarily. It just so happened, a year and a half into our mentorship and discipleship, when I started struggling with this, happens to be, and so that's been huge, having someone who will ask me. I don't have to be. I can be totally transparent, and they love me, and they will use God's word to, be able to teach truth, and a lot of times just the truth of the gospel, if you truly believe it really should dissipate any and all anxiety and depression. It's just a matter of whether you believe it or not, if it really gets in your heart and your soul. Because at that point, that's really exciting, if you believe it. And I think that's the difference. It's like, if you're honest with yourself, it's when you're not believing, which is that going back to that lack of trust. And I'd say the last one that's I've really learned really only in the past 2 years, maybe 2.5, is worship, which is really just gratitude, which, and maybe that's a better way to put it, is just being grateful. But I do a lot of worship on my own because I'm a horrible singer, and I like to worship sometimes when I'm driving, when I'm going places. A lot of times if I'm going to go work out, driving early in the morning to go, I like to have loud music and worship, and because no one can see me, I don't have to look like a fool for anybody else. But when I have intimate moments of worship with the Lord, I'm like at the opposite spectrum of anxiety and depression. Like if you can be the furthest from it, that's when it exists, which is and places of immense gratitude, which is what I think real worship is about thinking and dwelling on the things that God has done, which are many and immense. And so when you're doing that, it's almost like the same thing of being out in the woods and creation. It's like impossible to have anxiety if you really embrace it and you're really there and you're in like real worship, And that doesn't mean you have to go dance around with your hands in the air and things like that. That might be the way it is, but you can. But it's just like, I do sometimes. But worship with your heart. When your heart is worshiping, and no one knows if your heart's worshiping or not. So when your heart is worshiping, anxiety and depression cannot exist in that moment.
When you have anxiety, some things that you can do, I think reaching out, like Brenton said, it's important to have either a trusted friend, a mentor, a small group, a Bible study, some place where you feel safe enough to express what you're struggling with, what the obsessive thoughts are about. I know that's key for me, having people who know where I'm at with things and who can check in on me and how are you doing with this today, and how can I be praying for you, that kind of thing. And our small group does that for us too, and
we've done it for each other.
And the fact that we both have experience with anxiety.
Never actually had it at the same time.
I know. Thank you, Jesus, that we kind of take turns. Like when the other one's down, the other one kind of holds down the fort. It's kind of always been that way in our marriage, regardless of what it is. But
yeah.
I think reaching out. We both have seen counselors and have been really successful in that. Just someone who can kind of help you understand why your brain is processing the way it is, and that you're still normal even though you have these kind of crazy things happening.
I would just say that if you're going to do that's just my opinion, but I would make sure that counselor loves Jesus, because
that's a part of your healing, I mean, just to have counselors who are willing to pray for you right then and there, or they just know how to encourage us. And
because I don't know how else you would renew your mind and heal anxiety unless it involves Jesus, because that's where mine stems from. So I don't know how you could do that. But that's just me.
Yeah.
I'm pretty blunt.
Yeah.
But I would say what my wife touched on. I mean, I think you need to be intentional about surrounding yourself with a few or a decent amount of people who you can get isolated thoughts out of your head, and that Satan's lies can be defeated. And that's and cycle thoughts end. That's what really it's about. It's about ending those cycle thoughts. And it's about, a lot of times it's about someone who just has the gift of encouragement to encourage you and to speak truth and to love you. But God created this in community, so He wants us to be in community. And I think it's when you pull out of community and you're more isolated, not around other people, not talking about what's going on in your head or what you're experiencing, is when you're going to be more susceptible to it. Worship has been one that I did not like. It makes sense as you think about it, because real worship is just a grateful heart. It's aligning your heart with the gratefulness of just what God's done and just the freedom that comes with a life lived by His direction. So it's when you think about it, it's like, oh, that makes sense. But I don't think many people would say that. No one was like, that wasn't screaming out there. There wasn't advice about that. That's what very wise, close friend of mine has taught me.
As I'm thinking about like the prayer thing too, I feel like anxiety often can, most of the time it feels like a random thing. I guess maybe that's just my experience too, but like sometimes not even knowing why I'm anxious. Like it's just sort of this, you're just kind of worked up about things. And so I think that's why prayer is really important, is because in those moments for me and what my anxiety can look like, that's when I will turn to God and say like, okay, God, I don't even know why I'm panicky. Like, can you please show me what it is? Like if there's something within me that I need to change, if there's something that needs to be addressed, like, because a lot of times I don't even know why I'm panicky. And so then that's why for me prayer is important, is because he will often show me what it is that I'm getting worked up about. And without him, I would just kind of remain in that, panic state.
One of the things that prayer does that maybe would be like a fifth point, if I would have a fifth point, is like prayer makes you slow down, and prayer takes you out of your perspective and puts maybe more of like, brings you into God's perspective. And I think anxiety does really well in a super busy schedule. When you're maxed out and you're going, you're just going, just too much, because it's like it self-perpetuates and you're just maxed out. And so you have less, you're more tired, you're run down, you constantly feeling like you're stretched too thin. I think there's been times where anxiety has been solely because of just commitments to too much, trying to do too much, which ultimately leads to less time with God, less prayer, less time resetting. And when you're not doing that, like, it's not so much that a good Christian opens their Bible in the morning and is like this holier than everybody else. It's just, you're just resetting your brain. It's allowing God to reset you, because if you don't reset often enough, anxiety or other things can set in and run away. And so I think prayer is just an intentional way of just aligning your heart with God.